Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. I'm continuing a sub-series of episodes exploring the question, does anything in the cosmos have consciousness, and if so, what things? Is it everything? What type of consciousness and how? I decided to begin with what religious heritages have said about this before bringing in philosophy and physics. And so far, I've dipped into animism, and I've dipped into the Bhagavad Gita and the Buddha and Lao Tzu. I won't summarize those here. Instead, I'm going to come back to what I found in those heritages near the end of this episode when I attempt to compare all the religious heritages I'm consulting on this topic. And by all, I mean now adding the fact that I'll be referring to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim approaches to the question. I'm going to treat all three of these so-called Western heritages within one episode, and I'll do so by relying initially and in fact primarily on their main source text, their sacred scriptures. I'm taking this approach for a couple of reasons. First, in the case of Judaism and Christianity, those sacred sources were all in fact written by Jewish authors. So addressing those texts in one episode just makes sense to me. Second, relative to Islam, in the Quran it's clear that Muhammad understood that he was merely continuing the teaching and message of the prior scriptures of the Jews and Christians, and not bringing a different religion or religious way. So again, it seems to make sense to handle these together. Now, related especially to their understandings of the divine, these texts do differ, and I plan to explore that in the future. Christians view the Jewish scriptures to be part of their canon. Muslims understand that the Jewish and Christian scriptures are both heavenly books, so I am going to keep them all together here, even though there are differences in topics that we'll look at in the future. Now, as it happens, relative to the question at hand, these sacred texts actually do sing in harmony. And that's an assertion on my part, so I need to present the evidence. And I'm going to start with the Jewish scriptures. In the book of Genesis 1 and 2 describe the creation of all things. In chapter 1, verse 30, the text says that all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground are creatures which have the breath of life. It would seem that plants are different, as a distinction is made when the text says that every plant is given as food for the creatures that have the breath of life. A phrase also used of human beings in Genesis 2, meaning the phrase breath of life, and is taken there to link breath, the divine breath, human breath, with soul. Let me continue with the Psalms. From the Psalms, which is a collection of poems and prayers and hymns composed for use primarily in the temple, come these examples. Psalm 104, verse 26 says that God formed the sea creature called Leviathan to play, quote-unquote, in the sea, using a word that sometimes refers to ecstatic dancing. A more extended passage from Psalm 148, verses 3 through 10, says, "Praise him, sun and moon, praise him, all you shining stars. Praise him, you highest heavens, and you waters above the skies. Let them praise the name of the Lord, for at his command they were created, and he established them forever. And he issued a decree that will never pass away. Praise the Lord from the earth, you great sea creatures and all ocean depths, lightning and hail, snow and clouds, stormy winds that do his bidding, you mountains and all hills, fruit trees and cedars, wild animals and all cattle, small creatures and flying birds." And then from the book of Job, which is also considered sacred by all three religions, by the way. The text there says that the ostrich flaps its wings joyously, Job 39, verse 13, and the beasts of the field play in their surroundings, Job 40, verse 20. In short, in the Jewish texts, we find that all animate and inanimate creatures and beings are spoken to, and encouraged to speak and to offer praise. They play. They experience emotions. Later, I'm going to come back to ask whether this is all metaphorical or literal or not, but I want to note it there. Now I'll turn to the Christian scriptures. I'll refer to two texts from what Christians call the New Testament, the Gospel of John and a letter of Paul. So first, the Gospel of John. This is one of the texts that Christians hold sacred, but Jews do not. And whether it falls into what the Quran referred to as the Injil, which was a heavenly book given to Jesus and thus a sacred text for Muslims, is a matter that not all Muslims agree upon. And for any who do hold it to be such, it would be interpreted, of course, in a very different way than Christian understandings. In John chapter 1, we read about a word that was with God and is also divine. This is not the place to discuss how and in what way the Word and God are to be understood. But John goes on to say in verses 3 and 4 that through what he calls the Word, all things were made, through. And in that Word was life, and life was the light of humanity. So created things came to be and came to have life in and through this divine Word. This hints that all created things are connected in some way to at least a divine consciousness. And now Paul's letter to the Romans. It's a text from the Christian canon, a text that neither Jews nor Muslims, or at least certainly very few, would consider sacred. It's a letter from Paul to the early Christians living in the city of Rome, and I'm going to focus just on one fairly brief passage and just some statements from that passage taken from Romans 8, verses 18 to 22, which says things like this. The creation is waiting with eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. It says that creation will be liberated and share in the freedom of the children of God. It also says that the whole creation has been groaning like a mother giving birth. Now, in many ways, Paul's words are similar to the way that the Psalms and Job refer to things, because in both there's an attribution to plants and animals and things of what I would call personal qualities. In other words, that these things seem like persons, in the sense of being qualities like of a person who might have consciousness, emotions and thoughts and will and hope and those sorts of things. Let me turn to the Muslim scriptures, the Quran. And I'm just going to read a bunch of the verses that are found there, some of the most relevant verses from the Quran. Chapter 6, verse 38. There's not an animal on the earth nor any being that wings its flight that is not a people like you. Here it's comparing animals to humans and literally to a nation or tribe or culture of people. In chapter 22, verse 11, do you not see that all things that are in the heavens and on the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the trees, the animals, bow down to God in worship? And then in the 17th chapter, 44th verse, the seven heavens and the earth and all the beings in them proclaim his glory. There is nothing that does not celebrate his praise, even though you don't understand how they declare his glory. Chapter 13, verse 15. To God bow down all things in the heavens and the earth, either intentionally with goodwill or in spite of themselves. So in many ways, the things that we saw in the Jewish and Christian texts are resurfacing here as well. Things, animals, planets are presented as personal, having voices and choices and actions, etc. So let me summarize. This picture of consciousness in relationship to non-human created things in all three of the sources paints a picture that's quite consistent. Animals and plants and planets, for example, are portrayed as conscious of God. They praise and they worship God. The plants and animals are portrayed as living beings. In some cases, they play and seem to enjoy living and being, and may be waiting to enjoy it more in the future. So what is all that saying? And what's that like? Before I go a lot further with that, I want to share something. While I was preparing this episode, I was also responding to a creative prompt as part of being part of the Table Collective community. In the table collective, what we call table members are able to share things we create each month in response to themes and practices. And one theme that we've been focusing on very recently, or begun to focus on as table members, is the phrase, the sound of color. Now, while that theme does not automatically suggest having anything to do with the focus of this episode, it at least might not jump to your mind right away, I began to work on a song that was inspired by both that theme and this question about the cosmos and consciousness. My mind sort of went like this. If colors have sounds, and vice versa, then might not a rock have feelings? In each case, the podcast and the prompt, I found myself sensing that our categories don't always correspond to reality. Categories, for example, of sound, color, thing, personhood, and the way that we use those categories to separate those. And so this song emerged, The Sound of Color.
Howling whispers sound like silver, crimson echoes in my window. Water is singing, blue rain is calling, voices are purple in the shadows. That's the sound of color all around me. That's the sound of color in my soul. The sound of color. Branches singing in yellow whisper, crimson echoes in my window. Ocean waves crashing, I hear vermilion. Voices are purple in the shadows. That's the sound of color all around me. That's the sound of color in my soul. The sound of color. See the sounds, hear the colors, crimson echoes in every window, flaming water, lavender soprano, a chorus of purple in the shadows. That's the sound of color all around me. That's the sound of color in my soul. The sound of color. The sound of color. Sound of color. Sound of color.
colors having sounds, sounds having colors, the cosmos having consciousness, rocks singing, fish playing, and so on and so on. All of this begs a huge question. Is this true or a metaphor? Now, even the way I frame that question might suggest that I think metaphors are not true. In fact, I have a more nuanced approach, and I see metaphor as a way to express truth. But that's a topic for another conversation about truth. What I'm really asking here is not about what I think at all. So far, I've primarily presented the texts of the sacred books themselves. I want to find out what some other people think about that. And I have not yet included mention of how those texts have been interpreted within their respective heritages. That's what I want to look at now. So, for example, in the case of Christian teaching, I was always told, relative to passages like those in the Psalms about planets singing hymns, for example, that this is just metaphor. Anthropomorphism, a literary and artistic device, and implicit in this way of seeing things, as I was told it, was a somewhat dismissive assumption about consciousness of non-human things, usually with the exception of animals, however. And of course, that is quite possible. However, that assumption seems to me to be starting from a point of view that's already decided that, quote, plants and rocks and planets and wind are not conscious. Therefore, any language suggesting person-like qualities must be metaphorical. Well, I'm interested in exploring that question, and I'm interested in exploring how Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers might answer the question about metaphor. So let me first draw from some things I've seen in Jewish thinking. There are, of course, different schools of thought within Judaism, as in every religious heritage, and I can't include all of them, and so I'm just going to offer insights from two very influential streams, Orthodox Judaism and Kabbalah, a more mystical tradition. In Orthodox Jewish thinking, at least according to some rabbis, plants and animals have souls. In fact, every created entity has a soul, although I found no evidence that anything other than plants and animals are included, according to Orthodox Judaism. According to Kabbalah, every created entity has a soul, including plants and animals, and thus far that agrees with Orthodox Judaism. However, Kabbalah explicitly includes inanimate objects as well, meaning every blade of grass and every grain of sand. Having said that, in both streams of Judaism, it is clear that the human soul is considered the most complex of the souls. For example, in Kabbalah, there are 5 different levels of human soul. Given, then, that there are different levels of complexity of soul, we should assume, I assume at least, that there are different ways of being conscious or aware, different degrees of complexity in consciousness and awareness. So we can't simply ask whether this or that is conscious, but we must also ask, in what way? Let me turn to Christian thinking. There are a variety of opinions among some of the more influential Christian thinkers throughout history. Thomas Aquinas, for example, attributed soul to all organisms, but argued that only human souls are immortal. Martin Luther seemed to have believed that animals would be in heaven and would share in having transformed heavenly bodies. At least he spoke of his own beloved dog that way. Calvin rejected the discussion on the souls of animals because he saw it as speculation that simply couldn't be demonstrated. John Wesley believed that animals had souls. Some Christians in history have gone even further and suggested that God is in some way in all creatures, including animals and plants. So there's a variety of thoughts in Christian thinking. Muslim thinkers, if I turn to that now, here's what I've been able to discover. 2 main streams in Islamic thought on this matter. According to some Islamic thinkers, inanimate objects, including rocks and plants, etc., don't have souls. Inanimate objects lack the capacity for life and consciousness, and so the concept of a soul is strictly attributed to living beings, primarily humans, but also animals, although on a different scale. However, there is another stream within Islam which sees all things as having souls, and acknowledging that there is a great difference in the kinds of souls found in humans as compared to animals and plants and so on, still says they all have them. So, for example, vegetation grows and develops, and so for some Muslim thinkers this confirms that there's some sort of soul, perhaps consciousness even, in plants. One scholar I came across was actually quite explicit in taking the language of the Quran literally to make his point on this matter. He cited the incident in which a stone is portrayed as pleading with Moses to intercede on its behalf so that it might not be cast into hell. And his conclusion was that this indicates the rock had the ability to communicate and to feel emotion. Well, let me summarize. So, is the language we found in the sacred texts of these three heritages metaphorical or not? And specifically, is it metaphorical in the views of how different thinkers within those traditions have addressed it or how they see it? And the question isn't exactly phrased that way for the thinkers that I've been reviewing, not explicitly, not specifically. It may be that most thinkers within these three main religious heritages do see the language of planets worshiping or creation having eager expectation or sea creatures playing or rocks speaking as metaphors. However, the Jewish and Islamic heritages in particular do share the view that there are many types of consciousness and that some of those types of consciousness apply to many, if not all, the things and beings in the cosmos. They all have some type of it. So whether the language is metaphorical or not, they still view the world that way. That view seems to be much less widely held within the Christian heritage, however. And there's a lot of different views on that. Mainly, though, what I came across in the Christian heritage is a sense of not suspicion, but real reticence to say that some of the objects we've been discussing have consciousness, or a soul, certainly. So let me summarize some of the religious answers then about consciousness and things, because as I've just said, whether it views the language of their sacred texts or not to be metaphorical, certainly the Jewish and Islamic traditions and some within the Christian tradition land on saying that consciousness is to be found in different ways, but in many, if not all, of the things of the universe in some way. So let me summarize some of the ways that they might see consciousness and things. I'm giving myself then the task of briefly trying to summarize 7 different religious ways of understanding, because I'm not trying to just summarize now Christian, Jewish, and Muslim views, but also the views of the religious heritages that I've looked at in the prior 2 episodes, 7 different religious ways. I'm going to present them here in the order in which I've discussed them during the episodes. First, animism. In animism, as we've seen, everything, or at least most everything, is conscious in some way. There's forms of animism which would suggest that there are multiple spirits or energies or forces that are conscious, and forms which say it's the same spirit animating everything. But animism sees all of life as a reciprocal relationship with the spirits or spirit of all things. The Bhagavad Gita. In the Gita, there's a big S self, a big C consciousness, which is the self and consciousness of our very small S self. This big S self pervades everything, and the visible natural world is a manifestation of its energy. So there's some sort of connection between this manifest world and its energy and that big S self. What we experience as our individual consciousness is actually part of that natural world, and it's not our true self, but there is a consciousness which is somehow connected to all of this. The Buddha. In Buddha's teaching, consciousness is a flow of experiences and mental states. There's no self that actually has or possesses consciousness. Every self is just the flow itself. In general, Buddha's teaching, that inanimate, the teaching would be that inanimate objects don't experience consciousness in the same way that sentient beings do, though some Buddhists suggest that inanimate objects as well have potential for enlightenment, and that thus some form of consciousness is to be found in them, and that there may be some kind of interconnectedness with consciousness at a fundamental level, even if those objects and things don't have awareness of that. I would assume that if this is the case, as I've said before, then inanimate objects, if they do have consciousness, would, as with human beings, have no inherent consciousness. It's just the flow. Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu doesn't directly address the question of inanimate or non-human things and consciousness, but for point of comparison relative to human beings, the Tao Te Ching encourages cultivation of awareness of one's thoughts and actions in order to live in alignment with the Tao and then with our day, which can only be achieved through self-awareness. Consciousness, identified with awareness, is not something that just is, it's something that we need to seek out and cultivate. Jewish and Muslim and Christian. I'm going to lump them together here. Many things in the world, perhaps most things in the world, and for some thinkers, all things in the world, have consciousness in some measure. There's different ways of being conscious. Some thinkers, both Jewish and Muslim, attribute aspects of consciousness to inanimate objects which approach qualities of what I would suggest would indicate that things may have some sort of personhood. As I've indicated, the Christian heritage is much less homogeneous or unified on this point than the Jewish and Muslim traditions seem to be, but some Christians do think in this way as well. So there are differences clearly among these 7 heritages. 2 of them, namely Buddhism and Taoism, never really address the question of non-human objects and consciousness directly. I'm going to remain agnostic as to how Lao Tzu would respond, in fact, and relative to the Buddha, as I suggested, if Buddhism does in fact see non-human things to possess consciousness in any way, it would be in keeping with how Buddhism sees all consciousness, as not existing except in the sense of being the chain of experiences and perceptions and feelings and thoughts that arise and cease in an endless flow. So nothing is consciousness, or nothing is conscious, and what consciousness is that flow. However, 5 of the 7 heritages share in some way the view that the non-human world of things and plants and animals and rocks and more have some sort of consciousness and awareness. I'm including in these 5 religious streams that of animism, the Gita, Judaism, Christianity at least to a certain extent, and Islam. I do so because although the heritage of Christianity as a heritage seems to have a mixed response to my question, its source texts are in agreement with the Jewish and Muslim way of seeing things. And that way of seeing is this. In one way or another, we live in a world that is alive. There is consciousness everywhere around us. Is there a single supreme divine being? Multiple spirits that have consciousness and are somehow united with but distinct from the objects that they're associated with? Is there a supreme consciousness in which all things somehow exist? These heritages differ in how they'd answer, but somehow consciousness of some sort in some way is connected to everything, or at least to most things. I find myself wanting to say that the cosmos is humming with consciousness, which brought to mind one of my poems, a poem that I've shared in prior episodes, Touch the Ecstatic. Now, though at the time I wrote it, I had not done all the work that I'm presenting in these episodes, in the poem, I'm trying to imagine and express this sense that the cosmos is alive, is brimming with what is alive, in some mysterious but some very real way.
Touch the ecstatic. Inside that sway of grass and wind, this pulse, dull eyes, a dusty rose, there is something ecstatic. I cannot say, but I know, believe. More honest, I only want to live if I can believe and touch. Ecstasy is chaos dancing. Electrons, protons, morons, skeletons, put-ons, on and on, colliding on pulsing universe mystic strobe light floors, loved on. Ecstasy is a God's kiss, pressed on the first fleshy mouth, divine, moist, intimate breath through parted lips. Eyelids flicker open, embrace the gaze of God, entwined lovers in the afterglow, in a raw green world, satiated. Ecstasy is me beside myself, seeing inside myself, from outside myself, myself as myself, my own eyes, seeing me for the first time, tender. Ecstasy is joy unbridled, lustrous lust, throbbing, unholy godliness, walking naked, carnal, warm in the glow of Eden, wiping juice from giddy lips with the back of a wanton hand, unashamed. Loved on, satiated, tender, unashamed, joy unbridled, beside myself, a God's kiss, chaos dancing. I touch, am touched, ecstatic.
Now, for me, those words express more than a way of thinking. The poem captures my longing to not only know about or understand, but to touch. That longing is worth pausing for, worth allowing myself a few moments to experience and embrace and welcome. So I plan to do just that when I conclude in a few moments. But first, I want to look ahead. What's next? Is anything or nothing or everything in the non-human world conscious? And if anything is, in what way or what ways? Using my taxonomy from prior episodes, in what type of dimensions, in which of the dimensions is anything or nothing or everything conscious? One-dimensional, in which a subject experiences what happens? Two-dimensional, a subject experiences what happens and is aware of that? Three-dimensional, a subject, in this case a thing, object, animal, plant, experiences what happens, is aware of that, and is aware of being aware? As I continue to ask those questions, my plan next is to turn to the worlds of philosophy and physics. Now, I can't help but do so with these religious ways of seeing in my mind. I know that this is going to, in many ways, shape what I ask of philosophy and which schools of philosophy I find myself drawn towards. The same is true of physics, of course. My questions, as well as the answers I feel satisfied with, or at least am most interested in, will inevitably be shaped by the time that I have spent with animism, the Gita, Buddha, Lao Tzu, and the sacred texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But that's where I'm headed. Until next time.